So Rupert and Street Jesus, two of my top fans, just refuse to accept the writings within their own Bible as well as true history. So in this statement that Rupert is seconding what Street Jesus said, you are correct. Cain is the father of the Canaanites. In order for you to suggest that, you just have to completely ignore the history. You have to completely ignore the fact that the Bible statements are false. And then he's saying that through Ham's wife, and Africa always had spirituality, that God concept. Not in the same way, but yes, also in the same way. Hebrew Judaism is the teacher of every faith. You got to ignore some history in order to suggest that. But every faith on earth, and Christianity is her daughter, youngest daughter. Sounds very universalism. But here's the deal. Let's break this down. The first thing that you have to ignore is history. We'll go through history first, and then we'll look at their actual writings of the Bible and how they are flipping the Bible in itself, which is just like even making it even worse. But this is what people do when they don't want to follow the book and separate themselves from the religion, but yet still want to follow the book, but don't want to follow the book. So they create things. So historically, Canaanites were a group of people who were conquered by the Sumerians and the Akkadians way back, like 3,000 years ago. So these people were conquered by the Akkadians and Sumerians and under Sargon. Under Sargon, and they developed a pantheon of gods that were very similar to the Sumerian Akkadian gods, Enlil, Enki, Anu, Nenharsag, Ishtar, Inanna, all those. But they created their own pantheon. This pantheon primarily was El, his wife, which El, which equals Enlil, but El, his wife Asherah, which is Ninlil, and then their sons, Yahweh and Baal. Now, Yahweh was a storm deity. El was the wisdom deity. These two are taking parts from Enlil and parts from Anu in order to facilitate this god. El looks more like Anu with a little bit of Enlil. Yahweh is just a whole bunch of Enlil with a little bit of Anu. Later on, these two gods, El and Yahweh, become merged together. But for this time frame, they were conquered by the conquered by the Akkadians and Sumerian Empire. They developed their canon. Well, after a while, somewhere probably around 1250, 1280, 1300 BCE, a small group of people who were Canaanites decided that since they had been conquered by the Akkadians and Sumerians for so long, and now they're being ruled by the Egyptians, decided that they wanted to separate themselves from these seaside Canaanites and move out and become wanderers, sheep herders, out in the wilderness of the Levant, to be like in the mountains and hills of Israel today. Since they were separating from the Canaanites, they called themselves Israelites. They also started focusing on the worship of Yahweh. And over time, this worship of Yahweh grew into the worship of Yahweh merging with El, them still being married to Asherah. And then later on under Josiah, around about the 600s, high 600s, or early 600s BCE, they started to get rid of Asherah. God no longer has a wife, no longer has children. Yahweh and El becomes merged. So in order to make this statement, you have to ignore the fact that Israelites come from Canaanites. So therefore, Ham, Japheth, and Shem, as well as Noah, would have been Canaanites, not Israelites. They would have come from a Canaanite lineage. And here's the thing. Cain and Canaanites is simply wordplay, two words that sound similar but actually have nothing to do with each other. Cain's lineage, according to your Bible, was snuffed out during the flood. Yes, Cain's lineage had men and had women, but Cain's lineage is not something that you can attribute to the wives, of these three sons, because You don't know anything about these three women. You don't know their name. You don't know their parents. You have no idea where these women come from. They just come onto the scene. And unfortunately, because the Bible is so vague in so many instances, people can then create and manifest whatever storylines they choose. Here you're choosing to say that they were the daughters of a Canaanite lineage, and that Canaanite lineage comes from Cain. That's your speculation. Now, I would have given you more credit if you would have said that the sons of Seth were considered to be the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, and they were the ones who married the daughters of men. And then somehow they had a gigantism gene, and that gigantism gene was in the wise, and that's why there were giants. At least the Sethians get a little credit of creativity by saying that, but still, it is not something that you can state to be true because you don't know. You still don't know who these women are. These women could have still come from the line of Seth. These could have been their cousin wives, as we know how common that was in these people's time frame. You don't know. You have to make it up if you want to believe that. So we would have to ignore that history, and then you would have to ignore your Bible. According to your Bible, all the lineage of Cain was wiped out. All the giants were wiped out. The only people were left were those 8 people. So, but because they were vague, you can make up your own history. Now, to say that the Africans always had spirituality, that God concept, most forms of African spirituality was polytheistic. Yes, there was a supreme deity, but there was always sub-deities below it. These sub-deities in some respects were aspects, but for the most part, these deities were the representation and physical embodiment of God and a Godhead of rain, of thunderstorms, of fertility. And then it depends on which African tribe you're talking about. Y'all like to put everything just on Egypt and sometimes Ethiopia. But the Axiom Empire actually was a polytheistic empire until 330 CE. So at that time frame, the DMT or whichever empire, the Sabians would have been, they were polytheistic. They had multiple gods. If you were in sub-Saharan Africa, you would have ran into the multiple gods of Ifa, the multiple gods of different tribes, depending upon where they were. Inland tribes did not have ocean gods because they didn't know about an ocean. They had river gods, they had mountain gods, and they would have some supreme deity who reigned over all of them. So what you're saying is that Judaism and Hebrew had the same thing. Well, yes, they did. They were pantheistic as well until they decided around somewhere between the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE to become monotheistic. They weren't always monotheistic. They did not create monotheism in the way that you think. Zoroastrianism had monotheism before them. Egypt had monotheism for 17 years, long before them as well. It didn't stick. So sub-Saharan African spirituality has zero to do with Judaism and the Hebrews. Egyptians, they were there first. So elements of their religion are in your Judaism and Hebrew and your Hebrews and your Christian. So they took on from something that they knew before, because these Canaanites who separated and called themselves Israelites were once ruled by Egypt, but in the Levant, never in Egypt near the Nile. So your whole statement is just a bunch of made up things to make you feel more Afrocentric with your belief in this Bible, in this book, because you don't want to give up that disconnection. And that's what happens to many people. They see the problem with the religion. They see the problem with the history of the religion. They want to keep it, but they have to create things like this in order to make separations from it. And all that means is that you're just changing your indoctrination into another form of indoctrination. Instead of your husband beating you with his hands, he's beating you with a belt. That's the only difference. But you're still getting beaten. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.